Hi class, this is your teacher again, Mr. Cruz. I just wanted to come and bring you another quick video. It's going to be a little bit different than the previous one. The previous one, what I wanted to do was kind of walk you through chapter 19, which I thought might be a beneficial way of us understanding some of the things going on. But it was a little bit more summary than thematic driven, and this one's going to be a little more thematically driven. And I'm going to use three themes to really guide our time together. So the first theme is individual identity versus social world and its alienations. The second theme is sin and alienation. And then the third theme, finally, is the calling of a minister. I think that one is really is where I want to start off with, though, because we see this interesting dynamic that I don't think that we're quite used to. It's called Election Day. And Dimsdale finishes chapter 20 by going to produce an election day sermon. In fact, he is not content with the election day sermon he was going to give. He ends up throwing it away and beginning anew because he's going to create a better one. Now, interestingly, in the chapter, his election day sermon is not just a thing that he's going to do, but it's actually the way in which he's going to leave the profession of being a minister in the town. He's going to leave honorably, right? That's kind of what the text suggests. Now, Election Day is a bit of a colony-wide holiday. It's like a bit like a 4th of July sort of celebration, and there's cannon firing, military exercises. People are probably making food. It's a big, barbecues, all that kind of thing. And it's a day that's meant to symbolize the connection between civic life and the spiritual life. God's calling of the Puritans to leave England and establish a new world in this new colony, and to be God's messengers into a world in which they saw as ultimately falling and failing. And if you look into the history of the Puritans, very often you'll see much of the imagery that they use in sermons is one of sin that's rampant, and that's kind of the reputation Puritans get from a lot of other either denominations or just non-Christians in general. This idea that Puritans are very stodgy and rigid, and very often carry a great influence in the American colonies, precisely because they did feel this sense of exceptionalism, right, which has followed, I think, in our present day, this notion of American exceptionalism. And I don't think that necessarily means that you have to say, America is a great country, and shouldn't we also celebrate that and that sort of thing? I mean, I think that you can celebrate that. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. But there's a difference, I think. And I think that what a lot of people are repelled by in terms of this sense of American exceptionalism is this sense in which not only do you celebrate your country, but you create a division, a sort of boundary between your country and other countries to signify that you're good, exceptional, and then the other country is unexceptional or has no history, no sense of accomplishment, right? And this is why the Puritans are so foundational for us as a people. And I'm not saying that there's one political party or one person or one type of person that values the country more than another. For the most part, those sorts of again, boundaries that exist in political life for us are really arbitrary and kind of dumb, because we all have a sense of exceptionalism. And I think the interesting thing is that this virus has helped to expose that a bit, right? The fear that we have of the imposition of the virus outside of even just the physical ramifications of that our economic, and what would it look like for us to live as other countries do or have for a long time and have survived and made it relatively intact, right? Which kind of, I think, signifies a sense of exceptionalism that we are participating in, all of us. There's no right or left divide that's doing that. So for the Puritans, this was their holiday, a sense of civic and religious duty, right? That God has agreed and has given a covenant with them to participate in the common good, that this new world would be an outpost for the nations, right? And I think it's an important thing because Israel was seen as a kind of new nation that is springing up and is supposed to be blessed to be a blessing to the nations. The Puritans see themselves in the same sort of fashion. Now, what does this mean in terms of the calling of the minister? I think what it means is that the calling of a minister is something sacred then, if you're leading the people of God. It's not like, for example, in some manifestations of that calling, there's a sense in which, somebody prays for you and like, boom, you're a minister, right? Go ahead and get them for God. This sort of cavalier, and I'm not saying that I'm not bringing anybody out into the open in terms of who does it, and it's not like I'm naming names or anything. I'm just saying there are some people who, like right now, for example, there are certain traditions or certain people who ordain online, for example. Like you can get ordained online. Like you can get licensed to perform marriages, for example. Like you can get licensed to perform baptisms. Just these strange manifestations of what it means to be a minister, I think, are embodied in this lack of really a sense of care for the calling of the minister. Dimsdale understands that this is something incredibly sacred. That's part of the reason why he's feeling so poorly about this, so badly about this, right? And I think what we have to pay attention to with respect to Dimsdale is his sense of responsibility for not just Pearl and Hester, excuse me, but his sense of responsibility for the town that God has placed under his care, the spiritual life of all of them, and that he's been the chief of sinners, not in this sort of abstract way, but in a real way, right? And that doesn't mean that sin's not going on in town. Remember, we talked about that, and the Puritans love to talk about how important holiness was, but really the Puritans were just like us, with all that entails, everything. It just means that a lot of it was hidden, and that's the problem, I think, with even you saw in the Crucible, John Proctor's sense of hiddenness from his own wife, from the town, for example. I think that was common practice because people make mistakes, and I think that's part of what Hawthorne is trying to bring to the forefront, is that human beings are in fact human, and that they do err, or they let their passions, again, a romantic idea, they allow their passions or their sense of subjectivity, their feelings, to overrule them. And there are negative things to that, I think. There are also positive things to that, and I think that the positives happen to outweigh the negatives in the sense that we as humans are not necessarily shaped by this very rational, cold, and calculating sense, right? If you're only led by reason, you're a robot. You're not a human. I think that there's something positive to say that we are loving beings. We are beings that desire, and desire not just like in this like we use desire I think in the church in a lot of negative ways. And when I say, negative ways, I mean, we say desire as, like, for example, the desire between Hester and Dimmesdale that produced Pearl, for example. But really, all desire is, even in that relationship between the two of them, is the trace of something, some greater desire, the greater desire to be loved and to be known and to know, right? I think that's something that Hawthorne is trying to understand, right? Why we make these sorts of decisions based on our passions. It's partly because of the fact that there's so much of our life that is led by this sense of hiddenness, and not just that we're hidden, but that I'm hidden from you, right? That I don't have access to your own self, that your own sense of who you are is only accessible to you. But then even to you, it's not totally accessible, right? Because when we ask the question, who am I, or what am I? What is my purpose? I don't have a full access to that answer. I'm a bit sometimes confused about that, right? Sometimes I'm a little bit in my head about it. Well, and then maybe one day I say, well, I'm this, like I am Mr. Cruz. I am a Puerto Rican man living in West Palm Beach, and I teach at Calvary Christian Academy. And for maybe a day or two or something like that, maybe longer, I'll be satisfied with that answer. And then something, maybe a virus, right, wakes me up to a sense in which that thing now needs to be complicated a bit, right? That sense of the self and what it is malleable, at least on a human level, right? And remember, when we're discussing literature, we're trying to discuss it on a human level. And I think Dimmesdale's also wrestling with this sense of, and we're going to jump into identity in a second, this sense of loss of identity as on the human level of who he is, but then also thinking of this in the spiritual level about who he is, that belonging to God and having given vows to God to be a shepherd for the people there. This sense of the loss of oneself as he enters into another phase of his life, right? The question becomes, and I think I brought this up in the last Google Hangout, who won between Hester and Hester and Dimmesdale and society? Did society go and force them to plan to move to England, or to Europe rather, or did they make the individual choice? And I think here he's wrestling again with the sense of individual identity. Who am I? And the way that he's thinking about it, and this sense of alienation from the social world. Think about the people that come in contact with Dimmesdale in chapter 20. His responses to them, where Dimmesdale's very close to giving a very unchristianly response to many of them. But if you're trying to understand this scene and trying to understand what's going on, it's prudent probably for us to try to understand a sense in which there's a spiritual battle that's going on with Dimmesdale. He, remember at the beginning of the book, is this kind of weak and very sickly man who seems to be dying, honestly. Like it just seems that way. And he makes his own sort of transformation to this very combative guy, and combative in not just like he wants to fight everybody. Combative in the sense that like he's willing to face the town once more. He's not willing to hide his own face. In fact, he almost gives up the whole thing, right, to the people. So he's really trying to reserve himself, but it's difficult, when you've changed a bit. This meetup with Hester in the forest has changed him in many ways. Um, but he decides that he's going to reserve himself to the election day sermon. But if you think about this sense of alienation, the last thing I want to get to is the sense of sin and alienation that occurs in, I think, the full text, but in chapters 19 and 20. Sin and its alienations from the world, what it does is, according to the text, is it creates a distance. And I'm thinking not just distance between ourselves, and we've talked about that a little bit, and I don't want to get into too much more because then I'll just talk forever. But distance between relationships, and distance between human relationships is complicated when sin's involved, because we oftentimes want to treat human relationships with the relationship that we have, or that we sorry, my daughter's right here. That we often try to treat human relationships with the relationship we have with God, and in theory, it would be great if our relationship was at least somewhat similar. But the problem is that that person is not God, and we want to produce the same sorts of traits in our relationship, as in those relationships with other humans, as we do with God. So we say things like, well, like you're supposed to forgive, right? Like immediately after I say sorry. And unfortunately, things don't work that way. Anybody who's ever been in a friendship knows that you can't wrong the other in a significant way and expect immediately that thing is going to be resolved. It's not the way it works. That person has experienced hurt and pain. God does not have the same sense of hurt in which he withdraws, right? God, I think in Scripture there is definitely things that hurt him or pain him, especially with respect to sin, but he doesn't withdraw from us. The human relational level, though, people do withdraw. And sin does give us a sense of withdrawal. And Dimmesdale, having committed the sin, has had this withdrawal of his own self. We saw that in the first 18 chapters of the text, right? But you can also say, from his perspective, that sin has also led to a kind of social withdrawal, in the sense that when he's looking at other people, he sees other people withdrawn from him. It's based on perception, okay? The way I perceive somebody to look at me versus the way they're actually looking at me, right? Or I see somebody laughing at the other end of the street, for instance, and I perceive in my mind's eye that this person is laughing at me. Like they must, because I saw him glance over here. He must be looking at me in some way. This is a sense of social isolation, or rather alienation, that I think Dimmesdale is dealing with. And it's one of the major themes of the text, because it's going to play itself out, I think, in the coming chapters. I hope that this was somewhat helpful, especially given the fact that chapter 20 has a lot in it. But I didn't want to run through the narrative per se. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the themes. In particular, pay attention, I think, to this sense of alienation and this sense of the self and individual identity, right? And wrapped up in the calling of the minister. What is it that Dimmesdale is really dealing with? What's going on with Pearl and her own alienation from her father, in which, remember, she washes the kiss off her forehead, and she doesn't trust Dimmesdale. And I mean, let's be honest with each other. Dimsdale hasn't been the most present father, right? Um, I think that's totally fair, right? Maybe Pearl is experiencing her own sense of hurt or pain, and again, totally fair. You know, it'd be hard for me to feel bad for Dimsdale in that sense. Dimsdale has not been absent. He has not spoken up, and again, we've talked about this when we were actually meeting in class. But Hester does all the honorable things in this book I want somebody to do. She's a very honorable person. She's very redeeming. I gotta be honest with you. I love her. She takes care of her own kids. She starts her own little business. She does everything. I mean, you know, in a society, I wouldn't know what more she can do to put herself back in the good graces of the people of that town, and they've begun to accept her on this basis. However, there's still this separation that exists years, almost a decade later, and I think without saying it outright, Hawthorne is trying to illuminate this separation and or this alienation that exists because of that sin. It's not about judging it necessarily, right? And we can make our judgments and all that stuff. But I think for Hawthorne, it's not really about judging it necessarily outright. I think it's more about putting in context the way in which this sin can separate and divide, and putting in context the ways in which this family unit, right, between Hester, Dimsdale, and Pearl, how they can be affected by this one action, because actions do have consequences. And I don't think that Hawthorne is necessarily trying to give us a morality tale, but it's saying a fact, right? Actions have consequences. The things you choose to participate in have consequences. The things you choose to do, regardless of whether you think they affect you in the moment. I'm sure that Dimsdale and Hester probably didn't think that it would affect them at all. I mean, maybe a little bit, but not to this level. And so it's oftentimes the things that we think don't affect us, or that, oh, don't worry about it, or the ways in which you're thinking, oh, well, you won't get caught for that thing. Those oftentimes are the things that can affect us the most. Okay? So I'm going to leave it there. We'll talk at our Google Hangout a little bit more about this. Bye, guys.